The text message came in just as I was pouring my morning coffee. "You're banned from Thanksgiving, idiot. Don't you dare show up." The words glowed across the screen like a wound reopened. For a moment, I thought it was some cruel joke, but then I saw the sender's name, Mom. My hand froze midair, the mug trembling between my fingers. Outside my apartment window, Portland was wrapped in the quiet chill of late November. Families carried pies and casseroles into cars. I stood there barefoot on the cold tile, realizing I'd just been officially exiled from my own family's Thanksgiving dinner. My mother, Elaine Morgan, had always been the center of every celebration. Thanksgiving was her stage, perfect tablecloths, silverware polished to reflection, her cranberry sauce, made from a recipe she swore she learned from her grandmother in Maine. But behind every smile was a string pulled tight around me and my brother Ethan. She'd always said Ethan was the golden child, and I was the difficult one. For 30 years I tried to earn her approval, thinking maybe one day she'd see me as more than the girl who never followed her orders fast enough. I stared at the phone again. The next text came in short and sharp. "We don't need your bad energy today." My throat tightened. I had heard that phrase before years ago when I refused to co-sign a car loan for Ethan. "You're always ruining things, Rachel," she had said. "You bring bad energy." I had swallowed those words then, just as I had swallowed every insult that came before and after. But this time, something inside me shifted, a small, steady click of realization. I sat down on the couch and opened the photos folder on my laptop. The last Thanksgiving picture was from 3 years ago. In it, Mom was laughing with a wine glass raised high while I stood in the background, half smiling, holding a tray of rolls. The caption she'd posted read, "So thankful for family." It had 100 likes and comments from her friends. Nobody knew that 2 hours later she'd told me to stop acting like a guest and take out the trash. It's strange how silence can echo louder than shouting. The apartment felt heavier the longer I stared at those photos. I remembered every debt I had paid, every bill I'd handled since Dad passed away 7 years ago. Back then, Mom was overwhelmed, or so she said. "You're good with numbers," she had told me. "You handle the house stuff, sweetheart. I'll just sign whatever you need." So I did. Mortgage, water, power, internet, even the home insurance, everything under my name. I paid, I filed, I kept it running. And somehow I was still the idiot. The kettle clicked off. Steam curled up like smoke from a fire I hadn't realized was still burning. I poured the coffee, took a sip, and felt the bitterness spread through my chest. My phone buzzed again, this time with Ethan's name. "Mom said, don't make it weird," his message read. "Just stay home today, okay?" No apology, no defense, just obedience to her voice as always. I typed a reply but deleted it before sending. I didn't want to beg for a seat at their table. Not anymore. Let them have their perfect dinner, their laughter, their illusions. I'd been invisible long enough. A gust of wind rattled the window panes, scattering the last of the yellow leaves on the sill. I closed the curtains and opened my laptop again. The bank's logo glowed on the screen where I'd left it last week. There it was, the mortgage payment scheduled for the following Monday. My name, my account, my signature. Not hers, not Ethan's, mine. I leaned back and exhaled slowly, letting the truth sink in. Every dollar that kept that house alive, every bill that made their comfort possible, came through me. I had been financing my own humiliation for years. A strange calm came over me, the kind that follows a storm once you stop fighting the wind. I clicked through the tabs: utilities, credit cards, online banking. Passwords I knew by heart filled in automatically. Everything was right there, under my quiet control. Outside, the city stirred awake. The smell of roasted turkey drifted faintly from a neighbor's window. I could almost hear the laughter, the clinking glasses, the hollow, happy Thanksgivings bouncing off the walls of every home except mine. I thought about Mom's face, the way she tilted her head when she wanted to sound superior. "You'll never understand how much I've done for this family," she'd say. She was right about one thing I'd never understand. Because for all her talk of sacrifice, she never once noticed how much I gave up for her. The job I turned down so I could stay nearby when Dad got sick. The weekends I spent fixing the leaking roof, filling out her tax forms, covering Ethan's tuition when he flunked out of college. The phone buzzed again. A notification from my credit card company, another charge from the same grocery store near Mom's house. Wine, desserts, decorations, her signature Thanksgiving shopping spree. She was using the card as if nothing had changed. My lips curved into a small, humorless smile. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, and set it in the sink. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel powerless. I walked to the window, watched the clouds rolling across the gray Portland sky, and whispered under my breath, "You wanted Thanksgiving without me, Mom. Fine. Let's see how that feels." I sat back down, opened my bank dashboard, and stared at the list of active accounts. Mortgage, utilities, internet, credit cards. I ran my finger over the mouse pad and clicked one tab open after another. My reflection stared back at me in the dark screen of the laptop. The silence felt heavier now, but not painful. It was anticipation, quiet, deliberate, waiting to be shaped into something sharp. A soft chime sounded from my phone. Another message from Mom. This time, don't text Ethan. He's already stressed enough helping me. Just stay out of this. I smiled faintly. "Oh, I'll stay out," I murmured. My voice was calm, almost gentle. But inside, a new kind of power had begun to hum steady, certain, patient. The kind that doesn't need shouting or drama to make its point. Thanksgiving morning stretched on quietly. I watched the digital clock tick past 10, then 11. My mother's world was running smoothly, powered by the accounts I managed, the money I earned. She believed she had control. What she didn't realize yet, not even close, was that she had just handed me the perfect reason to remind her who really kept the lights on. And for the first time in my life, I was looking forward to Thanksgiving. The morning light spilled through the blinds, sharp and pale. Rachel sat at her desk, scrolling through old payment confirmations on her laptop. The list stretched back for years, mortgage, electricity, water taxes, all bearing her name. She sipped her coffee, staring at the words until the letters blurred. Every bill she had ever paid felt like a small receipt for silence. She clicked one of the oldest transactions, and for a moment, the gray bank interface became a doorway to another time, back to the days when her father was still alive, and everything in the Morgan family house still felt like a home. Her father, Frank Morgan, used to hum while fixing the old radio in their Salem kitchen. He wasn't a talker, but he had a calm presence that filled the space in ways her mother's sharp voice never could. Thanksgiving dinners used to be simple. Just the four of them squeezed around a small wooden table, her father carving the turkey with slow, steady hands. Elaine would complain about the cost of the butter or the mess in the oven, but Frank would laugh it off. He always said, "As long as the lights are on and the roof doesn't leak, we're doing fine." Back then, Rachel believed him. When Frank died of a sudden stroke, everything changed. Rachel was 25, still paying off student loans and working as a junior accountant. Elaine didn't cry at the funeral. She organized it. The next week, she took over the house as if nothing had happened. "We have to keep things running," she said. "And you'll help me, won't you, sweetheart?" Rachel had agreed, of course. She took time off work to help her mother handle the endless paperwork, insurance claims, bank documents, mortgage renewals. Elaine didn't like dealing with forms. "You're better at this kind of thing," she'd said, sliding the folder toward Rachel. "Put everything under your name so we don't lose time." Rachel didn't question it. It sounded practical, logical, like something her father would have suggested. The first account transferred smoothly. Then the second. Then the third. Within 3 months, every major bill, the house, the electricity, the water, even the home insurance, was under Rachel's name. Elaine had praised her for being so responsible. Rachel had felt proud then, like she was taking care of her family. But pride has a way of souring. By the time Ethan finished college, Elaine's tone had changed. You should be grateful, she would say whenever Rachel hesitated to send another payment. You're lucky to have steady work. Your brother's still figuring things out. Ethan was the golden child, handsome, careless, always forgiven. When he maxed out his first credit card throwing a party for his friends, their mother called it a learning experience. When Rachel reminded her that she'd been working double shifts to keep the mortgage current, Elaine just waved a hand. You're better with money. That's your talent. Rachel used to wait for her mother's approval the way children wait for spring. It never came. What came instead were small manipulations dressed as affection. Elaine would go silent for days whenever Rachel disagreed with her. She wouldn't yell no, her silence was sharper than any insult. She'd walk past Rachel in the hallway without looking at her, turn off the TV mid-sentence, make dinner for Ethan, and not set a plate for her. It was punishment disguised as peace. Mom, Rachel had asked once, "Why do you do this every time I say no?" Elaine didn't even turn around. "Because you don't listen unless you feel it." The words stayed lodged in Rachel's chest for years. When Ethan got his first job, he called to thank Rachel for paying his tuition. "You're good with that stuff, sis," he said, laughing. "You'll make a great mom someday." The compliment stung more than it soothed. To everyone around them, Rachel was the dependable one, the background figure who made life work so others could live it. Then came the envelope from the bank, 3 months before Thanksgiving. At first, she thought it was junk mail. Inside was a letter confirming a loan extension, $50,000 approved under her name. Her eyes froze on the signature at the bottom, Rachel Morgan. The handwriting was nearly perfect, but she knew immediately it wasn't hers. Her hands trembled as she called the bank. The representative confirmed what she already feared. "Yes, ma'am. The loan was renewed last month. We have a signed authorization on file." That night, Rachel drove to her mother's house in Salem. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air when Elaine opened the door. "Well, this is a surprise," she said, smiling. Rachel held out the envelope. "Did you sign my name?" Elaine blinked, feigning confusion. "What are you talking about? The loan, Mom? The one for $50,000? "Oh, that," Elaine said, brushing her hair back. "Don't be dramatic. It's a family loan. You've always handled the finances anyway. I just needed to renew it. Without asking me, I raised you," Elaine said, her voice turning cold. "You owe me that much." Ethan appeared in the doorway, holding a beer, sensing trouble. "What's going on? Your sister's accusing me of something ridiculous," Elaine said quickly. Rachel's voice was quiet but steady. "You forged my name." The room fell silent. Even Ethan stopped breathing. Elaine turned away, busying herself with the oven. "You always twist things," she muttered. "You think I'd do something like that?" "I don't think," Rachel replied. "I know." Elaine spun around, her face flushed. "I did everything for this family. You'd be nothing without me." Rachel looked at her mother, the trembling hands, the rage behind her eyes, and felt something shift. The fear that had ruled her life cracked and fell away. She turned to leave. "You just lost my trust, Mom." Ethan tried to stop her, but she was already at the door. For days afterward, her phone buzzed with messages. From her mother, "You're ungrateful. You've embarrassed this family." From Ethan, "Don't make things worse, Rach. She's just stressed." She didn't respond. Instead, she went back to her routine: work, coffee, sleep, but the world had lost its rhythm. Every time she looked at her hands, she saw the forged signature. A week later, she met with Daniel Cross, a lawyer she'd once worked with through her firm. He listened carefully, brows furrowed. "Forgery on a financial document is serious," he said. "You need to protect yourself. Keep every copy, every email. Record every call if she contacts you again." "I don't want to sue my own mother," Rachel murmured. Daniel leaned forward. "Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about drawing a line." She nodded. "Then I'll draw one." That night, rain fell hard against the windows of her apartment. Rachel sat cross-legged on the floor, the loan papers spread out before her. She ran her fingers over her mother's fake signature. The ink was faintly smudged, as if Elaine's hand had trembled. For a fleeting second, pity flickered in her chest. But pity was a dangerous thing. It was how her mother always got back in. She folded the papers neatly, slid them into a folder marked confidential, and tucked it inside her desk drawer. The phone buzzed again, Ethan this time. Mom says you're overreacting. Rachel typed back, then erased the message. Instead, she powered off her phone. The room was quiet except for the soft patter of rain. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a child being scolded. She felt like a woman reclaiming her name. When she finally stood and closed the curtains, she whispered to the empty room, "You forged my name, Mom. But you forgot everything you have still belongs to me." Outside, thunder rolled through the sky. Inside, Rachel felt a calm resolve settle in her chest. The storm had already begun, and this time she wasn't the one who would be standing in the dark. The rain hadn't stopped since that night. It poured relentlessly over Portland, washing the city in silver light. Rachel stood by her window holding a mug of coffee gone cold, thinking about the phone call she'd received earlier that day. The bank had called again, this time asking to verify details of her new personal loan renewal. $50,000. She hadn't signed anything, hadn't even been to the branch in months. When she asked for proof, the representative offered to email the scanned document immediately. Rachel agreed, her pulse hammering in her ears. The email arrived 10 minutes later. She opened the attachment, and there it was, the loan agreement with her name printed neatly on the signature line. The handwriting was almost identical to hers. Almost. The curve of the R was too stiff, the M a fraction too wide. But it was enough to fool a bank. Rachel leaned closer, zooming in until the digital paper filled her screen. The longer she stared, the clearer it became, her mother's shaky cursive hiding under her own name. Her stomach turned. She remembered the day Elaine had asked for her signature sample. It was about 6 months ago during a casual visit. The insurance company needs it to update Dad's old files, her mother had said. Rachel had thought nothing of it. She signed 3 sheets of blank paper, kissed her mother's cheek, and went home. Now she realized she'd handed her the key to everything. Her phone buzzed. Another email confirmation from the loan officer, cheerful and polite. "We've processed your renewal, Miss Morgan. Payments begin next month." Rachel's fingers went numb. She set the phone down, grabbed her car keys, and drove straight to Salem. By the time she reached her mother's house, the rain had softened to a drizzle. The windows glowed with a warm light, a deceptive calm. She knocked once, then pushed open the door. Elaine was in the kitchen stirring soup, humming along to an old Whitney Houston song. "Rachel, you should have called first," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. Rachel held out the envelope. "Why did the bank call me about a loan I never signed?" Elaine froze, the ladle hanging midair. "What loan?" "The one you renewed last month. The one with my signature on it." Elaine's tone hardened instantly. "Don't start with your drama again. It's a family matter. I handled it." "You handled it by forging my name." Elaine turned away, pretending to check the oven. "Don't be ridiculous. You've always managed our bills. This isn't any different." Rachel's voice stayed calm, too calm. "You used my signature, Mom. That's illegal." Her mother spun around, eyes flashing. "Illegal? I'm your mother. I've done everything for this family. You owe me this." Ethan appeared in the hallway wearing his hoodie, half asleep. "What's going on?" he asked. "Your sister's accusing me of fraud," Elaine said sharply. Can you believe that Ethan looked from one to the other, uneasy? "Ratch, maybe it's just a misunderstanding." Rachel turned to him, voice trembling with restraint. "A misunderstanding doesn't come with forged documents and bank calls." Elaine slammed her hand on the counter. "You always make yourself the victim. Do you think this family runs on magic? Someone has to step up, and I did what I had to do." "No," Rachel said quietly. "You did what you wanted to do, and you didn't care who paid the price." The silence that followed was heavy and brittle. The kitchen light flickered once, like the house itself was holding its breath. Rachel took a step back, her voice barely above a whisper. "You just lost my trust, Mom." She turned and walked out before either of them could reply. For the next 3 days, she ignored every call, her phone filled with texts that shifted from anger to guilt and back again. I can't believe you'd accuse me. You'll regret this. We're family. Don't make this worse. Ethan's messages were softer. Mom's not well. You know she didn't mean it. Please talk to her. Rachel didn't answer. She couldn't. The betrayal sat inside her like a stone too heavy to move. By Friday, she'd made up her mind. She called Daniel Cross, the lawyer who'd helped her firm with a tax case last year. His voice was calm and steady, a contrast to the storm still churning in her chest. I think my mother forged my signature on a loan agreement, she told him. I have the documents. He asked her to come in. When she arrived, the smell of paper and coffee greeted her. Daniel glanced over the copies she brought, frowning slightly. This is serious, he said finally. Forgery on a financial document is a felony. You could be held responsible for debt you didn't agree to. Rachel rubbed her temples. I don't want to destroy her, Daniel. I just want this to stop. He nodded. You're not destroying her. You're protecting yourself. Keep every email and document. Forward me the originals. I'll contact the bank on your behalf. For a moment she stared at him, searching for reassurance. She's my mom, she whispered. Daniel leaned back in his chair. And you're her daughter, not her shield. The words hit her harder than she expected. That night she couldn't sleep. The rain tapped against her window, rhythmic and endless. She got up, walked to her desk, and opened the folder labeled confidential. Inside lay every piece of proof: emails, bank statements, digital signatures. Her entire adulthood condensed into paperwork. She looked at her reflection in the dark laptop screen. What am I doing? She murmured. For years, her mother had made her believe obedience was love, silence was virtue, and boundaries were betrayal. But now, sitting there in the dim light, Rachel realized love without respect was just manipulation. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Elaine. You're breaking this family apart. Rachel exhaled. It was already broken, she thought. She opened a new folder on her computer, renaming it Evidence, Forgery 2024. Then she scanned every document again, one by one. It wasn't revenge, it was survival. When the clock struck midnight, Daniel's email arrived. I spoke to the bank's legal department. They will suspend the loan pending verification. Do not contact your mother for now. Rachel sat back, reading it twice. Relief came slowly, like air returning after being held too long. The next morning she woke early, made coffee, and stepped out onto her small balcony. The storm had cleared. A weak sun shimmered behind the clouds. Down below, people were already walking their dogs, sipping lattes, planning their weekends like the world hadn't just shifted. Her phone lit up again, 12 new messages. She opened the first, I can't believe you'd do this to me. The second, please fix it. They froze my account. The third, you'll regret this when I'm gone. Rachel's thumb hovered over the screen, but she didn't reply. She turned it face down on the table and took another sip of coffee. A calm, unlike anything she'd ever known, filled her chest. She knew the storm wasn't over there. Would be fallout, explanations, maybe even lawyers, but for the first time she wasn't afraid. She went to her desk, pulled out a notepad, and wrote the date in neat handwriting, the 17th of November, 2024. Below it she wrote, the day I stopped letting guilt make my decisions. Then she added one last line, justice doesn't always start in a courtroom. Sometimes it starts with a boundary. The words stayed on the page, simple and quiet. Outside, the city lights flickered back to life after the storm. Rachel sat still, watching them glow, her reflection faint in the glass. A woman who had finally drawn her line, and this time she wouldn't let anyone cross it. Thanksgiving morning came gray and cold. The city was hushed under a thin layer of fog, the streets wet from the night's drizzle. Rachel woke later than usual, wrapped in her old flannel robe, and stood at the kitchen window staring at the quiet parking lot below. Families were already on the move. She could see a mother carrying a pie, a father strapping kids into the back seat. Everyone was going somewhere warm. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced down, expecting a grocery promotion or a holiday reminder from work. But the message preview stopped her heart. You're banned from Thanksgiving, idiot. Don't you dare show up. The words glared at her from the screen, each one cutting deeper than the last. She stood frozen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. For a long moment, she simply stared at the message, waiting for it to vanish or turn out to be a mistake. It didn't. Another vibration. "We don't need your bad energy today." Rachel sank into the chair, her breath shallow. Her mother's voice played in her head, sharp and familiar. "You ruin everything you touch, Rachel." The words from years ago echoed perfectly with the new ones on her screen. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down. The silence in her apartment grew heavy. She picked up her mug from last night, the coffee cold and bitter, and drank it anyway. It grounded her. She told herself it didn't matter that she hadn't planned to go anyway. But the ache in her chest said otherwise. Outside, a few children ran across the street, laughing, carrying paper turkeys they'd made at school. Rachel watched them through the glass and felt something inside her crumble. Thanksgiving had always been her mother's favorite performance table set, perfectly family photos, neighbors invited. Elaine would smile in every picture, while quietly criticizing every dish Rachel cooked, every dress she wore. Last year, during dessert, her mother had announced to the entire table, "Rachel doesn't know how to keep a man. Maybe that's why she spends so much time with spreadsheets." Everyone laughed. Rachel had smiled too, pretending the joke didn't sting. After dinner, she'd wash dishes until her hands went raw, trying to scrub away the humiliation. Now, the same woman who'd called her useless had decided she wasn't even worthy of showing up. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Ethan. Mom said, "Don't make it weird. Just stay home, okay? No apology, no explanation, just obedience, as always." Rachel stared at his message until the screen dimmed. Then she let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Okay," she whispered to herself. "Stay home." Sure. She pushed her chair back and went to her desk. The laptop still displayed the same list of accounts she'd opened days earlier, mortgage, power, internet, credit cards, all neatly labeled, all under her name. She hovered the cursor over the payment schedule. A laugh, small, humorless, escaped her lips. "Idiot," she murmured. "Right." Her eyes moved to the framed photo on the shelf. It was Thanksgiving 6 years ago, her father's last one. He was carving the turkey while Rachel and Ethan stood on either side, smiling. Her mother sat at the head of the table, eyes full of pride and control. Even in the picture, Rachel looked slightly apart, her smile too polite, her body tilted away. She picked up the frame and studied it. "You'd hate what she's become, Dad," she said softly. "Or maybe she was always like this and you just kept her steady." The words hung in the air like a confession. A gust of wind rattled the window. Rachel shivered, set the photo back down, and opened the bank tab. Her cursor hovered over the section marked automatic payments. Her gaze traced the lines: electricity, Rachel Morgan; water, Rachel Morgan; mortgage, Rachel Morgan. All the things her mother used daily, all sustained by her idiot daughter. For years, Rachel had told herself she was helping, being the responsible one, the good daughter. But now, for the first time, she saw it differently. Every bill she paid was another string her mother pulled. Every transaction was another way she'd been tied to her family's control. She closed the laptop. The screen went dark, reflecting her face back at her, tired, steady, no longer small. A soft chime pulled her attention back to the phone. Another message from her mother. "Don't text Ethan. He doesn't need your negativity today." Negativity. The word almost made her laugh. She typed a reply, then erased it before sending. No point. Words had never reached Elaine, only results ever did. Rachel stood and walked to the window again. The city below was waking up in full color now, steam rising from rooftops, laughter echoing from balconies. For everyone else, it was a day of gratitude. For her, it was a day of revelation. Her mother had banned her from Thanksgiving. But her mother had also forgotten one small, inconvenient truth. Nothing in that perfect house, no light, no warmth, no comfort, existed without Rachel's name on it. She turned away from the window, feeling something shift in her chest. Not anger this time. something colder, something sharper. At noon, she made herself a small sandwich and sat down to eat. The TV played muted coverage of the Macy's parade. Balloons floated past cheering crowds, all noise and joy. She felt detached from it, like watching another planet. Her phone buzzed again. A photo notification from social media, her mother's post. The caption read, "So thankful for family." In the picture, Elaine was smiling at a crowded table, a golden turkey at the center. Ethan stood beside her, arm around her shoulder. The lights were bright, the silverware gleaming. Rachel zoomed in. On the far corner of the table, she could see a single empty chair. Her chair. She stared at that photo for a long time. Her mother's public perfection had always been her favorite lie. And now Rachel realized she had been funding it all along. The electricity, the mortgage, the Wi-Fi, powering the fake smiles, every bit of it came from her accounts. From her name. Something inside her clicked into place. She opened her laptop again. The screen came alive with the soft glow of the dashboard she knew so well. One by one, she opened each service portal: power company, water, internet, bank. Her fingers hovered over the controls, not to act yet, but to understand. Every login, every password, every confirmation screen was hers alone. She whispered to herself, "They think I'm powerless because I stay quiet." The thought didn't hurt. It steadied her. She saved each account's access link into a single folder and named it Thanksgiving, Justice. The name made her smile. Not a grin, not satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had begun. When she finished, she closed the laptop and sat still, listening to the low hum of the fridge. Her heart no longer raced. In the silence, she realized that forgiveness wasn't the opposite of revenge, it was indifference. And she was finally indifferent to whether her mother approved, invited, or even remembered her. Still, there was a spark of something deeper, not malice, purpose. Rachel whispered, "You wanted Thanksgiving without me, Mom. You'll get it." She stood stretched and poured herself a fresh cup of coffee. Outside, the afternoon sky dimmed into soft gray. For the rest of the day, she didn't check her phone again. The messages could pile up, the photos could keep coming, it no longer mattered. When evening settled, she lit a small candle on her kitchen counter and watched the flame flicker against the glass. In the reflection, her eyes were calm. Thanksgiving was supposed to be about gratitude, but for Rachel, it had become something else entirely, an ending disguised as a beginning. She took a deep breath, the candlelight warming her face, and whispered, "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom." Then she blew out the flame. The morning after Thanksgiving was eerily quiet. Rachel woke before the sun, her body stiff from a night of restless half-sleep. Her apartment was still, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. She wrapped herself in a sweater and sat at her desk. Her laptop glowed in the dim light, still open to the list of accounts she had reviewed the day before. Mortgage, electricity, water, internet. All of it, every essential thing her mother relied on under her name. She took a slow sip of coffee, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. The bitterness steadied her. She wasn't angry anymore, not even sad. Just clear. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop lying to yourself about who people are. She clicked through the old payment confirmations, scanning each line for a sense of ownership that had always been there but never recognized. For the first time, she didn't feel like a daughter supporting her family. She felt like a woman running an empire built on her own signature. The drawer beside her desk creaked as she pulled it open. Inside were the neatly stacked folders she had organized after her father's death: utilities, insurance, property deeds. She flipped through them one by one, the pages whispering like ghosts of old obligations. Every document bore the same stamp: account owner, Rachel Morgan. Her mother had insisted it was just for convenience. "You're so good at paperwork, sweetheart. I'd just mess it up," Elaine had said. Rachel smiled faintly. She used to think her mother's requests were signs of trust. Now she saw them for what they were: disguised control. Each signature had tightened the leash until one day she realized the leash wasn't around her, It was around her mother. She found the latest statement for the house mortgage. The date read November 28th. The payment was set to auto-debit from her account in 4 days. Her name was printed in bold letters under the property address, 1428 Hampton Lane, the same house she had been banned from just a day earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her. She set the document aside and turned to her computer. The email icon blinked with a new message from Daniel Cross. If you decide to proceed with the account protection steps, make sure to document everything. Quietly. She reread the last word twice. Quietly. That was her strength now. Rachel opened a spreadsheet and began listing every account tied to her finances. The list grew quickly: Hampton Lane Mortgage, Auto Debit Monthly, Power Company, Account Rachel Morgan, Water Utility, Paid via Rachel's Card, Internet Provider, Main User Rachel Morgan, Credit Card, Secondary User Elaine Morgan. She paused after the last line, running her finger slowly under the printed names. Every line was a connection, a cord that kept her mother's world alive, and every cord ran through her hands. Her phone buzzed, startling her. A text from Ethan. Mom's still upset. Can't you just call her Make Peace? Rachel stared at the screen for a long time before replying. She made her choice. So did I. Then she set the phone face down. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Outside, the clouds began to break, sunlight seeping through. She stood and opened her curtains. Below, the city was waking up, ordinary and unaware. A delivery truck rumbled past. Someone walked their dog, laughing into a phone call. Life moved on, indifferent to personal revolutions. Rachel returned to her desk and logged into her bank's online portal. The interface loaded with familiar precision, her kingdom of numbers. She navigated to automatic payments and hovered the mouse over each service. She didn't act yet. She just looked. Understanding was the first act of power. Her reflection stared back from the screen, calm, unflinching. She whispered, maybe control isn't about shouting. Maybe it's about knowing which switch to turn off. She took out her phone again and dialed Daniel. He picked up after 2 rings. Rachel, how are you holding up? I'm fine, she said. If I wanted to protect my accounts from being misused, what's the best first step? Daniel's tone shifted to professional. Temporarily freeze any shared cards, remove secondary users, and change your online passwords. Do it quietly, and keep documentation. You're the legal owner, so you're within your rights. Rachel nodded. So I can suspend payments without notice? Yes, as long as they're in your name. It's not revenge, it's protection. She smiled faintly. Protection. I like that word. After the call, she opened her credit card settings. With 2 clicks, she located the section for authorized users. Secondary user Elaine Morgan. She clicked remove. The system asked for confirmation. Are you sure you want to remove this user? Rachel typed yes. A small green checkmark appeared. Update successful. It was almost anticlimactic how simple it was to redraw years of power dynamics. Next, she logged into the power company's website. Her cursor hovered over suspend service. The note beneath read, can be reinstated within 48 hours. She smiled. Temporary control, reversible at will. It felt like the perfect metaphor for her new boundaries. She didn't click yet. Not today. The act of knowing she could was enough. Her eyes drifted to the photo on the wall, her father again, smiling under a string of Christmas lights. He had been the balance, the gravity that kept the family from spinning apart. After he died, Elaine had filled the void with control, and Rachel had mistaken it for love. Now, staring at the mortgage statement and her father's picture, she realized something profound. She hadn't lost her family. Her family had lost her. The thought didn't hurt. It freed her. The phone buzzed again, Ethan persistent as ever. She's saying you cut the cards. What's going on, Rach? She can't pay for groceries. Rachel's jaw tightened, but her reply was calm. Then maybe she'll start appreciating who kept the lights on. No response came back. She returned to her spreadsheet and added one more line: Ethan's phone plan. Under family account R. Morgan. She looked at it for a long time, a small reminder that control had layers, and she'd barely scratched the surface. The afternoon drifted by in quiet focus. She changed her passwords, saved receipts, printed account summaries. Each click was deliberate, steady, a ritual of reclamation. When the sun began to sink, she stepped away from the desk and opened her window. The cold air smelled like rain and pine. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear faint laughter from a neighboring building. It sounded like freedom. On her desk, the documents were neatly stacked again, but this time they didn't feel like burdens. They felt like weapons of truth, tools of justice. She opened a new folder on her desktop and named it Thanksgiving, Justice. Inside, she saved every file, every proof of ownership. It wasn't about punishment, it was about order. She looked around her apartment. Everything here, every lamp, every mug, every bill was hers. Hers alone. No guilt, no manipulation, no silent judgment. Rachel whispered into the stillness. If they erased me from their table, I'll erase their comfort from mine. It wasn't spite, it was symmetry. By nightfall, the sky turned a deep velvet blue. She made herself tea and sat by the window, notebook open in her lap. On the first page, she wrote a single line: "Power doesn't scream. It moves quietly." She closed the book, took a slow breath, and looked out at the lights flickering across the city. The world outside went on as always, people celebrating, forgiving, pretending. But inside her small apartment, something monumental had shifted. Rachel was no longer the obedient daughter keeping the peace. She was the architect of the storm that was coming. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the thunder. Rachel woke before dawn, long before the first light touched the Portland skyline. The air was cold, the kind of sharp chill that crept into her lungs and cleared her head. She brewed a cup of coffee, black and strong, and sat at her desk. The laptop hummed quietly, waiting. The folder named Thanksgiving, Justice sat on her screen like an unspoken promise. She clicked it open. Inside, every document was lined up perfectly: mortgage, utilities, credit cards, internet service. Each file was a reminder of the control she had unknowingly built over the years. But this morning wasn't about reflection. It was about precision. She opened the first tab: her bank. The balance glowed faintly, a familiar comfort. With steady hands, she navigated to automatic payments. Her mouse hovered over the line that read mortgage, 1428 Hampton Lane, her name next to her mother's address. She let her finger rest there for a heartbeat before clicking pause payment. A message popped up. "Are you sure you want to suspend this payment?" Rachel typed yes and pressed enter. The confirmation flashed on screen: quiet and final transaction complete. She sat back, exhaling slowly. No rush of guilt, no thrill of vengeance, just calm control. Next, she clicked into her credit card account. Her mother and Ethan were still listed as authorized users. Secondary users, the system called them, as if the label alone justified dependency. Rachel scrolled to the bottom of the page and selected Remove User, E. Morgan. Then Remove User, A. Morgan. Her heart didn't race. It stayed steady, measured. She clicked Confirm. The screen blinked: Update successful. Rachel smiled faintly, setting her mug down beside the laptop. She could almost hear her mother's voice in her head. "You're being dramatic, Rachel. You'll regret this." But she didn't regret anything. She logged into the power company's website next. Her account dashboard greeted her with cheerful blues and greens icons labeled Managed Service Billing Support. She found the small tab at the bottom: Suspend Service, Temporary Maintenance. Her mouse lingered there. The idea wasn't to punish, it was to remind. Click. A loading circle spun for a few seconds before a message appeared: Request received. Suspension scheduled for today at 6:00 p.m. Perfect timing. She took another sip of coffee, her reflection staring back at her from the screen. It wasn't revenge, it was balance. For every insult, every manipulation, every quiet humiliation, she was reclaiming a piece of herself. Her phone buzzed. Daniel's name appeared. "Morning," she answered. "Morning," he replied. "Did you take care of the accounts?" "Yes, all of them." Daniel's tone was calm but approving. "Good. You're not breaking any laws, Rachel. Everything's in your name. You're simply exercising your right to control what's yours." "That's what I needed to hear." He hesitated. "You sound different." Rachel looked out the window. The city was still wrapped in gray mist. "I guess I am." When the call ended, she closed her laptop and stood up. The apartment felt lighter somehow, as if the air itself had shifted. She put on a coat and walked outside, letting the cold wind brush against her cheeks. It was still early, and the streets were quiet except for the distant sound of a garbage truck. As she walked past the small park at the corner, she thought about her mother. Right now, Elaine would be fussing over her perfect Thanksgiving leftovers, maybe on the phone with one of her friends, complaining about how ungrateful her daughter was. She probably hadn't noticed yet that every comfort she enjoyed, every bill, every light, every connection was still hanging by Rachel's fingertips. By mid-afternoon, Rachel was back home. The smell of rain had followed her in. She made herself a cup of tea, this time chamomile, soft and steady. She turned her laptop back on, checking each step one last time. Mortgage paused, credit cards frozen, utilities scheduled for suspension, internet pending disconnection. Everything was in order. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. She didn't imagine chaos or shouting or revenge. She imagined silence, the same silence her mother had always used to punish her. Only now, silence would serve her instead. Her phone buzzed again, a text from Ethan. "Mom says her card isn't working." "Did you forget to pay the bill?" Rachel typed back. "No, Ethan, I didn't forget." 3 dots appeared, then vanished. No reply. She placed her phone face down and looked at the clock. 5 p.m. 45 minutes until everything began. Outside, the sun was dipping low, turning the clouds gold and gray. Somewhere across the city, her mother was probably lighting candles, setting the table, trying to make the evening look effortless. Rachel pictured the kitchen, the same one where she'd been scolded for stirring the gravy wrong as a teenager, and wondered how it would look without the hum of light. At 5:45, she poured herself another cup of tea and sat by the window. The streets below glowed softly with holiday lights. Her phone lay silent beside her. 6:00 p.m. A quiet chime sounded from her laptop. Service changes confirmed. Rachel imagined the moment it happened, her mother walking into the kitchen to find the oven off the lights, flickering, the Wi-Fi dropping mid-song. She pictured Ethan checking his phone, confused when the mobile plan stopped syncing. Maybe her mother would call the power company first, then the bank, and only after that Rachel. Rachel didn't move. She watched the city lights, instead a faint smile curving her lips. When the first call came, she ignored it. The second, too. By the fourth, she switched the phone to silent. The world outside continued, undisturbed, cars, moving people laughing, the hum of life unchanged. Inside, Rachel sat in perfect stillness. She thought about Daniel's words, "You're not breaking any laws, you're protecting what's yours." That was all this was. Protection. Not cruelty. She picked up her pen and wrote in her notebook, 6:00 p.m. Systems suspended. Control reestablished. The phrase looked clean, almost clinical, but beneath it was something deeper. Peace. Her phone lit up again with Ethan's name. This time she answered. "Rach, Mom's freaking out. The power's out, her cards declined, even the internet's down. Did you do something?" Rachel's voice was calm. "I stopped paying for things that aren't mine." "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice rising. "Everything she uses," Rachel said slowly, "was under my name. Every bill, every account, every comfort. She told me I was an idiot. I believed her for a while. Not anymore." Ethan was silent on the other end. Then quietly, "She's crying." Rachel closed her eyes. So was I. For years. She ended the call before he could say more. Outside, the wind had picked up. She stood and opened the window, letting the cold air fill the room. It carried the faint scent of smoke and pine, sharp and alive. On her desk, the laptop screen dimmed the folder Thanksgiving, justice glowing softly in the dark. Rachel touched the trackpad and whispered, "Justice doesn't need noise." The room filled with the quiet hum of the heater, the only thing she hadn't turned off. The irony made her smile. By the time she crawled into bed, the phone was still lighting up across the room, calls, messages, all unanswered. She let them ring into silence. Tomorrow there would be consequences, explanations, apologies maybe. But tonight there was peace. She closed her eyes and breathed in the quiet, letting it settle deep inside her chest. For the first time in her life, her mother's world was the one spinning in darkness, and Rachel's was finally filled with light. By the time the sun set, the city had come alive with warm lights and the faint hum of Thanksgiving evening. Rachel sat by her window, her apartment bathed in the golden glow of the street lamps below. On her laptop, a single browser tab remained open, her utility account dashboard. The timer on the page read 6:00 p.m., service suspension confirmed. She didn't smile. She simply closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair, listening to the quiet rhythm of her heartbeat. Somewhere across town in the large brick house at 1428 Hampton Lane, her family was setting the table. Rachel could picture it as clearly as if she were standing there, the clinking of dishes, the smell of butter and herbs, her mother barking orders while pretending to be gracious. Elaine Morgan's voice would rise and fall, commanding, orchestrating. Ethan would nod along, playing the good son, pretending not to notice how her temper flared whenever things weren't perfect. It was always the same show. But tonight the stage lights were about to dim. The first call came at 6:07 p.m. Rachel glanced at the phone vibrating on the table, Ethan's name flashing across the screen. She didn't answer. A few minutes later, another call. Then another. By 6:15, her screen was filled with notifications. "Mom, Rachel, what did you do?" "The power's out, Ethan. Wi-Fi's dead. Mom's losing it." "Did you forget to pay something?" Rachel set the phone face down and walked to the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of red wine, the sound of liquid against glass, drowning out the faint buzz of the phone. Outside, she could see families gathered around glowing windows, laughter spilling out into the cold air. It was strange, she thought, how warmth could feel so far away, even when it was everywhere. She imagined the scene inside her mother's house. Guests awkwardly murmuring as the lights flickered, the oven shutting off, mid-bake candles being lit in a flurry of confusion. Elaine's voice cutting through the chaos, sharp, panicked. "Check the breaker, Ethan. Call the company. This can't be happening." Rachel sipped her wine. Another vibration. "Mom, you think this is funny? We have people here. The messages kept coming one after another. Answer me. You better fix this right now. Everyone's leaving." She sat back down and stared at the phone, the screen lighting up her face in soft bursts of light. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel guilt. Just quiet balance, like gravity had finally evened itself out. The apartment was dim except for the flicker of candles she'd lit earlier, the glow reflected in the wine glass like small fires trapped in glass. Rachel turned on soft jazz, the notes low and steady. She didn't need noise to celebrate. Silence was enough. In her mind, she could see the dominoes falling one by one. The power first, then the internet, then the realization. The bank card declines at the grocery store when Elaine tries to buy more candles or call an electrician. The panic when every attempt to fix it leads nowhere. Rachel could almost hear her mother's voice trembling as the truth began to surface. "What do you mean the account's under Rachel Morgan? She's the owner, ma'am. We can't disclose information without her authorization." Elaine would hang up, furious, humiliated. And for the first time in her life, Rachel's mother would know what it felt like to lose control. By 6:40, the phone stopped ringing. A lull before the storm. Rachel took it as her cue to sit quietly watching the fog roll through the city streets. In the reflection on her window, her face looked softer, calmer. Then, at 6:52, the lights in her apartment flickered slightly, just enough to make her glance up. A coincidence, perhaps? Or a poetic echo? She smiled faintly, realizing that power always had a way of shifting, sometimes quite literally. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a voicemail notification. She pressed play. Elaine's voice came through, breathless and uneven. "Rachel, I don't know what you're doing, but this isn't right. People are here. You're embarrassing me. I can't even heat the food. Please just fix it. You've made your point." Rachel turned off the voicemail before it ended. She whispered into the empty room, "No, Mom, not yet." At 7 o'clock, another text arrived from Ethan. "She's crying now. Please, Rach, don't do this." Rachel hesitated this time, staring at the message. A flicker of something's sadness maybe passed through her, but it faded quickly. She typed back one sentence, "Now you know how it feels to be left in the dark." She pressed send and put the phone away. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, faint and rhythmic. The world carried on, indifferent to family wars and generational wounds. Inside her apartment, the air smelled of candle wax and peace. Rachel leaned her head against the window pane and let her thoughts drift. She thought about all the years she had been told to stay quiet, to not make a scene. The way her mother's silence used to punish her, the wordless treatment that could stretch for days, until Rachel finally apologized for things she hadn't done. And now, silence had become her weapon. It didn't scream. It didn't break things. It simply left them to crumble on their own. By 8, the calls began again, dozens of them overlapping, frantic. She let them ring, her phone's screen filled with notifications until it dimmed itself from inactivity. She poured another glass of wine and walked to her balcony. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet pavement and chimney smoke. Down below, families were laughing in their dining rooms, holding toasts, living in their bubbles of comfort. Rachel stood alone, and yet for the first time she didn't feel lonely. Her thoughts wandered to the moment her mother had called her an idiot, to the message that started everything. The insult no longer burned. It had become a catalyst, a reminder that sometimes you have to be called a fool before you realize you were the only sane one in the room. At 8:15, a new message appeared. "Please, Rachel, the guests are gone. It's just us. The house is freezing." She traced the outline of the words with her finger but didn't reply. Instead, she whispered softly, "Justice doesn't come easy, Mom." She turned off the ringer entirely and placed the phone in a drawer. The silence that followed was almost holy. The rest of the night moved slowly. She ate dinner, a simple bowl of soup, and wrote in her journal. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate. 6:00 p.m. power off. 6:30 p.m. silence begins. 8:00 p.m. calls stop meaning anything. When she looked up, her candle had burned halfway down. The flame trembled, slightly reflected in the window like a tiny lighthouse. She thought again of her father, of his calm presence, and the warmth that used to fill that same house. He would have been disappointed by what the family had become. But perhaps she thought he would have understood this moment not as vengeance but as balance restored. By the time midnight arrived, the city outside had gone quiet again. Rachel stood stretched and blew out the candle. The faint trace of smoke curled upward, dissolving into the dark. Her phone, silent in the drawer, was still lit up with missed calls and unread messages. She didn't need to look. She knew what they said. Before going to bed, she walked to the window one last time. Somewhere beyond the fog in that dark house on Hampton Lane, her mother was probably sitting in the same darkness she'd once forced on her daughter, confused, angry, powerless. Rachel didn't smile this time. She just whispered into the night, "Now we're even." Then she closed, the curtains, turned off the light, and let the darkness settle around her, not as punishment but as peace. The first message came just after midnight. The entire house went dark. Rachel stared at the words glowing on her phone, her reflection faint in the screen. She could almost hear her mother's voice behind them, tight, with panic clipped with pride, unwilling to beg but already breaking. Another message followed, then another. The food's ruined. The guests left. Are you happy now? Rachel put the phone face down on the table. Outside, the rain had started again, tapping softly against her windows. Her apartment was quiet, except for that sound and the faint tick of the clock on the wall. She reached for the blanket on the couch, pulled it around her shoulders, and sank deeper into the stillness. For a long time she just sat there listening to the city breathe. Far away a siren wailed and faded into the distance. In her mind, she could picture the scene perfectly, Elaine pacing through the dark kitchen, flashlight in one hand, anger in the other. Ethan trying to calm her down, fumbling with the breaker switch. The guests whispering awkward goodbyes as they slipped out into the night. Every piece of the family performance collapsing in real time. The phone buzzed again. 36 unread messages. Rachel didn't need to open them. She knew what they said: rage first, then fear, then pleading. It was always the same cycle. Elaine never apologized until she was cornered. And even then, her apologies came wrapped in blame. She turned off the phone and set it aside. Silence filled the room like a tide. The image of her mother's house came back to her. The perfect kitchen with its marble counters and endless rows of china, the living room decorated like a magazine spread. She'd once loved that place. The smell of her father's cologne still faint in the hallway, the worn chair he used to read in. After he died, it had stopped being a home. It became a museum of appearances, curated by Elaine's obsession with control. Every inch of it spotless but lifeless. And now, without power, it would be plunged into real darkness for the first time in years. Rachel imagined her mother lighting candles, muttering about incompetent service companies refusing to admit what she already suspected. The irony was perfect. Elaine had spent her entire life controlling other people's light, deciding who got warmth, who was left in the cold. Now she was the one shivering. Rachel stood and walked to the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, golden and steady. She thought about driving by the house just to see it, one black shape among glowing streets, but she didn't. Seeing it wasn't necessary. The peace she felt didn't come from watching her mother suffer. It came from knowing that balance had finally been restored. Her father's voice echoed faintly in her memory. Justice doesn't need to shout, Rachel. It just needs to stand. She smiled to herself. You were right, Dad. At 2 a.m, she woke again to the sound of her phone vibrating. She didn't look at it, but curiosity eventually got the better of her. When she unlocked the screen, her eyes moved over the flood of notifications: 112 missed calls, 36 new messages. The latest one read, Rachel, please, we're freezing here. I didn't mean what I said. Please fix this. Rachel stared at the message for a long time, her thumb hovering above the screen. Then she typed back a single line, I know. She didn't send it. Instead, she deleted the draft, locked the phone, and placed it on the counter. She poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the dark window. Her reflection looked different now, older maybe, or simply freer. She whispered to the empty room. I'm not destroying you, Mom. I'm just unsaving you. The words lingered in the air, soft but final. In her mind, memories surfaced: Thanksgiving dinners, where Elaine would cut her down with a smile, the nights she was told she wasn't enough, the days she paid the bills while being called ungrateful. She had spent her whole life apologizing for existing. Tonight, for the first time, she didn't owe anyone an explanation. The rain stopped around 3. The air was cold, sharp. Rachel sat on the couch, pulling her knees to her chest. She could almost feel her mother's panic on the other end of the city, the restless, pacing, the anger, the guilt, maybe even the fear of something deeper than darkness, irrelevance. Because what frightened Elaine most wasn't losing electricity, it was losing control. Rachel thought about turning the lights back on, calling the companies, restoring everything. She could fix it with a few clicks, but the thought drifted away as quickly as it came. This wasn't about punishment. It was about truth. Her mother had always believed power was something you took from others. Tonight, Rachel had learned it was something you could reclaim quietly without permission. At 4, she finally drifted to sleep on the couch. The city outside was still and dark save for a few distant headlights gliding across wet streets. She woke just before sunrise. The sky was pale gray, the kind of color that erases the night without promising much warmth. Her phone sat silent now, the screen dark. She picked it up, scrolled through the unread messages one last time, then deleted them all. No anger, no satisfaction, just release. She brewed coffee, the smell filling the small apartment. The warmth of the mug in her hands felt grounding. As she sipped, she replayed her mother's last voicemail in her head, the pleading, the fear, the tremor in her voice. She hadn't known Elaine could sound that human. For a fleeting second, compassion flickered in her chest, but she didn't feed it. Compassion was what had kept her trapped before. Instead, she walked to her desk and opened her laptop again. The Thanksgiving Justice folder was still there waiting. She clicked it open and reviewed the steps one more time, every confirmation, every transaction. She created a new file and labeled it proof of forgery. It wasn't over. The investigation Daniel had filed would move forward soon. There would be questions, paperwork, maybe even legal consequences. But Rachel was ready. This time she wasn't scared. Her phone buzzed again, a final text from Ethan. Mom's sleeping on the couch. She said she didn't realize how much you'd done for us. Please, Rach, just talk to her. Rachel read it, then turned off the phone. She stepped outside onto her small balcony. The air was cold and fresh. Across the city, windows glowed faintly as people began their day. Somewhere, coffee brewed, doors opened, cars started. The world was moving forward. She closed her eyes and breathed in deeply. Thanksgiving had ended in silence, but she realized now that silence wasn't absence. It was power. It was peace. She leaned on the railing, letting the wind brush through her hair. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like someone's daughter or someone's disappointment. She was just Rachel Morgan, no one's property, no one's scapegoat. As the morning light spilled across the city, she whispered, "Now you know what darkness feels like, Mom. I hope it teaches you what light is worth." Then she went back inside, poured herself another cup of coffee, and let the new day begin. When Rachel opened her eyes, the sky outside had already turned a dull silver. The rain had stopped, but the city was still soaked and heavy with silence. She reached for her phone out of habit, then froze when the screen lit up. 112 missed calls. 36 messages. All from her mother and Ethan. She set the phone down on the nightstand and sat up slowly. Her neck ached from falling asleep on the couch, but her mind was clear. The digital clock beside her read 8:04 a.m. Somewhere across town, her mother was probably pacing again, replaying the blackout over and over in her head, trying to shift blame, trying to rewrite the story like she always did. Rachel poured herself a glass of water and walked toward the window. Portland was gray and still, cars moving sluggishly through the wet streets. She tapped the screen of her phone again. The first message popped open automatically. "I can't believe you'd do this to me." The next, "Your childish stunt ruined Thanksgiving." Then, "Rachel, please. I know I've been hard on you, but you went too far." Her eyes drifted to the voicemail tab. 6 new messages. She hesitated, then pressed play. The first was a torrent of anger, Elaine's voice sharp, accusing. "You humiliated me. Do you have any idea what people are saying?" The second was quieter. "Rachel, I just need to understand. Why would you do this to your own mother?" The third was broken small. "Please call me. The house is cold." Rachel stopped the playback. The words filled the apartment like a ghost. She walked to the kitchen, poured coffee into her mug, and stood for a while, watching the steam rise. The sound of her mother crying didn't feel triumphant. It just felt distant, like hearing the echo of something that used to hurt, but couldn't reach her anymore. The phone buzzed again, a new message from Ethan. "Mom's a mess. She hasn't slept. Please talk to her. She's scared." Rachel typed a reply, deleted it, then tried again. She's scared because she finally lost control. She'll survive. She didn't send it. Instead, she turned the phone face down and took a sip of her coffee. She thought of the night before, the silence after the blackout, the faint thrill of knowing that the world she'd been forced to hold up had finally collapsed. But what surprised her most wasn't satisfaction. It was peace. She didn't want her mother's suffering. She wanted the truth to exist without excuses. At 9, her phone rang again. The caller ID made her stomach tighten. Daniel Cross. "Morning, Daniel," she answered, her voice even. "Morning," he said. "You might want to sit down." Saturday. "What happened?" "I spoke with the bank's fraud department. They've confirmed the forged signature. The handwriting analysis came back definitely your mother's. The investigation is moving forward." Rachel leaned back in her chair. "So it's official?" "Yes. They've frozen her accounts until further notice. The bank will contact her directly to discuss restitution." Restitution. Such a clean word for what felt like the messiest kind of justice. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked after a pause. Rachel nodded, though he couldn't see her. "Yeah, I'm fine." "Good. You've done nothing wrong. I'll handle everything from here." Don't respond to any messages from her. Let the process work. When the call ended, Rachel sat in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. The process would work. Slowly, inevitably, just like the sunrise that had started to brighten her living room. She went to her desk and opened her laptop. The folder proof of forgery was already there waiting. She added the new email from Daniel, labeling it official confirmation. For a moment, she just stared at the file list, the quiet evidence of everything she'd endured. Her phone buzzed again. Ethan this time. The bank called. "Mom's freaking out. She said they're investigating her." "What did you do?" Rachel exhaled slowly. She typed back, "I told the truth." No response came. By noon, the sky had lightened slightly, but the apartment remained dim. Rachel lit a candle on the table and sat down with her journal. The act of writing felt grounding. November 29. The house is dark, the bank is quiet, and for the first time, so am I. She paused, then wrote another line. Justice doesn't look like fireworks. It looks like silence after years of noise. Her handwriting wavered slightly, but the words steadied her. Another call came through her mother this time. Rachel didn't pick up. She listened to the voicemail a minute later instead. Rachel Elaine said softly, her voice cracked and raw. "I know I made mistakes. I know I've said terrible things. But you can't let them do this. I'm your mother. Please don't destroy me." Rachel's hand tightened around the phone. She played the message again, slower this time, listening carefully. "I'm your mother." It wasn't an apology. It was a command wrapped in guilt. It always was. She deleted the voicemail and closed her eyes. For years that sentence had kept her chained. "I'm your mother." It was the shield Elaine hid behind the justification for every insult, every manipulation, every forgery. But not anymore. The knock on her door startled her. 3 sharp raps. She opened it cautiously. Ethan stood there, his expression drawn and tired. "Can I come in?" he asked. Rachel hesitated, then stepped aside. He walked in and dropped onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. "She's losing it," he said quietly. "The power's still out. She's terrified about the bank. She says you've turned on her." Rachel folded her arms. "I didn't turn on her, Ethan. I just stopped letting her use me." "She's our mom," he said, his voice breaking. Rachel looked at him, really looked at him, the boy who'd always been protected, who'd never had to question his place. "No," she said softly. "She's your mom. She hasn't been mine for a long time." Ethan stared at the floor, silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. "She's crying all the time. She said she never meant to hurt you." Rachel felt a flicker of something, pity maybe, but it faded quickly. If she didn't mean it, she wouldn't have done it again and again. He didn't argue. He just nodded, slowly stood up and headed for the door. "I just wanted you to know," he said, before leaving. When the door closed, the apartment fell back into silence. Rachel sat there, staring at the empty space he'd left behind. She didn't feel anger or relief, just the strange weight of truth settling into its place. The afternoon passed quietly. She worked for a while, answered a few emails, tried to act like it was any other day. But every so often, her eyes drifted to the folder on her computer screen. Proof. Justice. Freedom. By evening, the last bit of sunlight faded. She made dinner, something simple, soup and toast, and ate at the kitchen table, the candle still flickering beside her. Her phone stayed dark on the counter. When she finally picked it up again, there was one last message from Ethan. "Mom's resting now. She said she finally understands what you were trying to say. Maybe she needed this." Rachel read it twice. For the first time, she felt her chest loosen. She set the phone down and whispered, "Maybe we all did." The night was quiet except for the rain starting again, light and steady. She looked around her small apartment, the space glowing softly with candlelight. Everything she owned was hers, untouched, unborrowed, unclaimed. She finished, her tea, blew out the candle, and let the darkness wrap around her like a blanket. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, calls, apologies, maybe even consequences. But tonight, there was peace. And that, she realized, was the first real inheritance she'd ever had. The morning began with a single email from Daniel Cross. "Bank confirmed the forgery," the subject line read. Rachel's stomach tightened as she clicked it open. His message was short, written in the crisp tone of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "The investigation is now official. The bank's fraud division has submitted your mother's case to the state attorney's office. Expect contact within the week." Rachel read it twice, then closed her laptop. The apartment was still, except for the sound of the rain. She stared out the window for a long moment, watching droplets trail down the glass. She thought she would feel vindicated. Instead, she just felt still, like a wave that had finally stopped breaking. Her phone buzzed. "Elaine." Rachel didn't answer. The voicemail came seconds later, her mother's voice trembling and shrill. "The bank froze my accounts. They said, there's an investigation." "What did you do, Rachel? You have to fix this right now." Rachel poured herself coffee, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't listen to the rest. At 1030, her phone buzzed again. Ethan this time. "Mom's freaking out. Did you report her?" "She said the police might come to question her." Rachel typed back. "The bank reported her. Not me." Then she put the phone away. For the rest of the morning, she worked at her kitchen table, trying to focus on invoices and spreadsheets. But every few minutes, her phone would light up again, missed calls, new voicemails, half-formed apologies buried inside accusations. "I didn't mean to forge anything. You're twisting this. How could you do this to your own mother?" Around noon, she called Daniel. "She won't stop," Rachel said. "She's calling every 5 minutes." "She will," Daniel replied calmly. "Once the investigators contact her, she'll have to stop speaking about the case. Let them handle it. You don't need to engage." Rachel sighed. "What happens now?" "They'll ask you to verify your documents," he said. "Your copy of the original signature, your account records the messages from her. I'll handle the rest. The bank is already cooperating." "Will she go to jail?" There was a pause. "That depends on how she responds. But Rachel, that's not your burden to carry. This is about accountability, not punishment." Rachel nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Accountability," she repeated. The word felt strange in her mouth, foreign, heavy, real. That afternoon, the storm outside grew louder. Wind rattled the windows, bending the trees along the street. Rachel sat at her desk, the laptop screen casting a faint glow over the room. For the first time, she opened her email folder titled "Proof of Forgery" and read through everything she'd saved. Each message was a quiet record of what she had endured, years of control, guilt, and obligation compressed into digital evidence. At 2 o'clock, her phone rang again. This time she answered. Rachel Elaine's voice cracked through the line, raw and desperate. "Please, you have to help me. They're saying I could lose the house. The mortgage is in your name. If you don't step in, they'll think I'm guilty, Rachel interrupted softly. They already know, Mom. I didn't mean to. It was just one signature. You've always handled these things better than me. I thought it wouldn't matter. Rachel's voice stayed steady. It mattered. You can't let them ruin me. I didn't, she said quietly. You did that all by yourself. Her mother's breathing on the other end was heavy, uneven. Then came the old defense, the same one she'd used Rachel's whole life. After everything I've done for you, Rachel's patience broke, but her tone didn't rise. You keep saying that like it's a shield. You didn't raise me to be strong, Mom. You raised me to serve you. Silence stretched. Rachel could almost hear the realization settling in. Then Elaine whispered, I just wanted to feel safe. Rachel closed her eyes. For a flicker of a moment, she saw her mother not as the tyrant of her childhood, but as a frightened woman clinging to control. But sympathy didn't erase damage. I understand that, Rachel said, but you made your safety everyone else's prison. She hung up before Elaine could respond. Later that evening, Daniel called again. They've scheduled an interview, he said. You'll give a statement tomorrow. They might ask for your mother's messages and any financial links. I have everything organized, Rachel said. I figured you would. His voice softened. You're doing the right thing. When the call ended, Rachel sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker to life. The rain had stopped, but puddles still shimmered across the road like fragments of glass. She thought about how her mother must have felt when the first investigator called, sitting in that spotless kitchen, realizing for the first time that her perfection couldn't protect her. The neighbors would find out soon if they hadn't already. The gossip would spread quietly, politely. Did you hear about Elaine Morgan? Some kind of fraud investigation? It wasn't revenge, it was gravity. What goes up pretending to be flawless must eventually fall under the weight of truth. At 7:00 p.m., Ethan showed up at her door. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. She's a wreck, he said before Rachel could speak. The bank called again. She can't access her credit. She's terrified. She should be, Rachel said. Ethan's jaw clenched. You really want to see her destroyed like this? Rachel shook her head. I don't want her destroyed. I want her to face what she did. I'm done cleaning her messes. She's our mother, he said, his voice cracking. Rachel looked at him gently. Then go help her, Ethan. You're still the son she chose. He flinched but didn't argue. For a moment his eyes softened, full of something between guilt and understanding. You know she's not evil, right? She's just broken. I know, Rachel said quietly. But broken people still cut others when they refuse to stop swinging the glass. Ethan exhaled shakily. She said she wished Dad was here. So do I, Rachel murmured. He left without another word. The apartment grew dark as night fell. Rachel didn't turn on the lights. She liked the shadows. It made everything feel balanced, contained. On her desk, the folder of documents still glowed faintly on the screen. She minimized it and opened her journal instead. December 1st. The investigation began today. Mom's power finally met the law. Justice isn't loud, it's quiet. It's paperwork and signatures, the same tools she used to control me. Now they free me. She paused, then wrote one more line. I don't hate her anymore. I just don't belong to her anymore. When she put the pen down, the rain started again, soft against the window pane. She stood, wrapped herself in a blanket, and sat on the floor beside the window. The city glimmered faintly through the drizzle, indifferent and alive. Her phone buzzed once more. Another message from her mother. Rachel hesitated, then opened it. You win. For a long moment, Rachel stared at the words. Then she typed back. It was never about winning. She didn't wait for a response. She turned off the phone, set it aside, and closed her eyes. The steady rhythm of rain against glass lulled her into a quiet calm. Tomorrow she would give her statement. Tomorrow there would be headlines, paperwork, and more phone calls. But tonight there was peace. A peace she had built herself, signature by signature, truth by truth. And as she drifted to sleep, she whispered into the darkness, You taught me control, Mom, but I learned justice. The knock came late on a Saturday afternoon. It was soft at first, hesitant, then firmer, as if whoever stood outside wasn't sure they belonged there. Rachel froze, a dish towel still in her hands. When she opened the door, her mother was standing there. Elaine Morgan looked smaller than Rachel remembered. Her hair, once perfectly styled, hung flat and uneven around her face. The woman who used to wear pearls and perfume now stood in a worn cardigan, clutching a purse like it was a shield. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice low, brittle. Rachel hesitated. Then she stepped aside. "Yes." Elaine walked in slowly, her eyes darting around the apartment as though she was entering foreign ground. "You live here alone?" she asked, forcing a small smile. Rachel nodded. "I like it that way." For a long moment neither spoke. The only sound came from the faint hum of the refrigerator. Finally, Elaine sat down on the couch, setting her purse neatly beside her knees. "You look tired," she said quietly. "I've been working a lot," Rachel replied. Elaine's gaze dropped to her hands. "So have I." Her laugh was hollow. "Mostly at trying to fix the mess you created." Rachel crossed her arms. "The mess I created," Elaine sighed and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "You know what I mean. The investigation. The neighbors won't stop talking. I can't even go to the grocery store without someone looking at me like I'm a criminal." Rachel stayed quiet. "I lost everything," Elaine continued. "My credit, my reputation, even the women from church stopped calling." "You forged my name," Rachel said simply. Elaine's head dropped. "I know." The silence that followed was sharp, slicing through the room like glass. Rachel could hear her mother's breathing, quicken the faint rustle of her sweater as she wrung her hands together. "I didn't mean to hurt you," Elaine said finally. "I was desperate. After your father died, I didn't know how to keep things together. I panicked." Rachel sat across from her, studying the face that had haunted and shaped her life. "You didn't panic," she said softly. "You planned. You took control like you always do. You used me to hold your world up because you didn't want to admit it was falling apart." Elaine's eyes glistened. "That's not fair. It's the truth." Her mother turned away, her voice trembling. "I'm your mother, Rachel. You can't talk to me like I'm a stranger." Rachel's voice didn't waver. "Then maybe you should have treated me like your daughter instead of your insurance policy." Elaine's shoulders sank. "You're cruel," she whispered. "No," Rachel said. "I'm honest. There's a difference." Elaine stood suddenly, pacing the small living room. "You have no idea how hard it's been for me. I lost your father. I lost the house." "You didn't lose the house," Rachel interrupted. "You lost the illusion that it was yours." Her mother froze mid-step. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, solid and final. After a moment, Elaine sat back down, her movements slower this time. She stared at the floor. "Do you hate me?" she asked quietly. Rachel shook her head. "No." Her mother looked up, surprised. "Then why are you doing this?" Rachel thought for a long time before answering. "Because I spent 30 years trying to earn your love by letting you control me. And I finally realized love that costs you your self-respect isn't love. It's submission." Elaine blinked, as if the words were too heavy to process. "I just wanted to feel safe," she whispered. "You took everyone else's safety to build yours," Rachel replied. Her mother's voice broke. "I know." For the first time, Rachel saw her mother's hands trembling. Elaine wasn't the immovable figure she'd grown up fearing. She was just a woman, aging, frightened, full of regret she didn't know how to name. Rachel stood, walked to the kitchen, and returned with a glass of water. She set it in front of her mother. "You should drink," she said quietly. Elaine's eyes filled with tears as she reached for it. "You're still taking care of me," she said. "Even after everything." Rachel shook her head. "No, I'm taking care of myself. There's a difference." Elaine stared into the glass, her reflection trembling in the water. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. "You don't fix it," Rachel said. "You face it." Her mother's gaze lifted slowly. "They're saying I could lose everything." Rachel exhaled. "Then maybe it's time you start over." Elaine's lip trembled. I don't know how to be anyone else. That's the problem, Rachel said softly. You've only ever known how to be in control. Elaine nodded weakly, tears spilling down her cheeks. I never wanted to be like this. I wanted to protect you. By hurting me, her mother's sob was small and sharp. I didn't know any other way. Rachel sat beside her, the distance between them finally small enough to feel the weight of everything unsaid. You can't control what happens next, she said, but you can stop pretending you were the victim. Elaine looked up, her expression raw. You sound just like your father. The words hit Rachel like a soft wind, unexpected and strange. For years she had tried to live up to her father's quiet steadiness, his sense of right and wrong. Now hearing it from her mother felt like a benediction. That's the best thing you've ever said to me, Rachel said. Elaine gave a small, broken laugh. He would have handled this better. No, Rachel said. He would have forgiven you faster. I'm not him. Her mother smiled faintly through her tears. No, you're stronger. The quiet stretched again, but it was different this time, softer, not suffocating. Rachel stood and walked to the bookshelf. She pulled down a framed photo of their family. Her father smiling with a hand on her shoulder, her mother beside him, Ethan grinning at the camera. Rachel stared at it for a long moment, then carefully opened the frame and slid out the photo. She tore it gently down the middle, separating her father's side from the rest. She placed his half back in the frame and set it on the windowsill. The other half she folded once and slipped into a drawer. Elaine watched her silent. That's harsh, she said. No, Rachel replied. It's honest. For a long while they both sat in silence, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. Elaine wiped her eyes and whispered, I don't deserve your kindness. This isn't kindness, Rachel said. It's closure. Her mother nodded slowly, as if the word itself was a weight she could finally set down. It was dark by the time Elaine stood to leave. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame. I don't know what's going to happen with the case, she said softly, but if I lose everything, I hope you'll remember that I loved you even if I didn't know how to show it. Rachel met her eyes. I know, Mom, but love without respect isn't love. Elaine nodded once, then walked out into the cold evening. Rachel closed the door gently behind her and leaned against it, her eyes closing. The air in the apartment felt lighter, the walls less heavy. For the first time, the silence didn't sting. It soothed. She turned off the lights, leaving only the faint glow from the street outside. Before heading to bed, she whispered to the empty room, You taught me control, Mom. Now I've learned freedom. And as the city settled into its night rhythm, Rachel finally felt what she had been chasing all along. Not victory, not revenge, but peace. The morning light slipped through the curtains, soft and golden. Rachel stretched under the warmth, her body slow to wake, but her mind at ease. It had been a week since her mother's visit, 7 quiet days that felt like a lifetime of calm. The storm was over, both outside and inside. She brewed coffee and opened the window, letting the cool December air fill the room. The city moved lazily below her, children in winter coats, delivery trucks, the smell of rain fading into sunlight. For the first time in years, she didn't wake with a sense of dread. The weight in her chest was gone. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Daniel. Good news. The case is being closed soon. Bank confirmed full ownership under your name. You're officially clear. Rachel smiled faintly. It wasn't victory, she felt it was release. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the quiet hum of her apartment. The house on Hampton Lane was still hers technically, but she didn't want it anymore. It had stopped being a home long ago. She had no plans to sell it or return. Some ghosts were better left unvisited. She walked to her bookshelf, pulling down the photo frame she'd taken from her old room. The one she'd separated in half the side with her father back in place, smiling in his flannel shirt. You'd like this, she murmured. Things being clean, simple. She set the frame back on the shelf and poured another cup of coffee. Her laptop chimed softly. Work emails, invoices, a reminder for an online meeting. Ordinary life returning quietly without drama. The normalcy felt like a gift. When her phone rang again, it was Ethan. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey," he said, his voice subdued. "How are you?" "I'm fine," she said, meaning it. "And you?" "I'm trying to be." He paused. "Mom's been going to therapy. She said she's sorry. I think she's realizing what she did." Rachel leaned against the counter. "Good. That's her journey, not mine. She wanted me to tell you she's proud of you." Rachel almost laughed, but it came out as a sigh instead. "She doesn't need to be proud. She just needs to learn." Ethan didn't argue. "She asked if you'd ever talk to her again." "Maybe someday," Rachel said quietly. "But not today." They talked a little longer about work, about the rain, about nothing at all until the call faded naturally. When she hung up, Rachel realized her hands weren't shaking. There was no anger, no guilt, no rush of adrenaline, just stillness. She spent the rest of the morning cleaning, folding laundry, washing dishes, watering the fern by the window, the kind of small grounding tasks that keep the world turning. When she finished, she opened the drawer of her desk and pulled out the folder labeled Thanksgiving Justice. She stared at it for a long moment before dragging it to the trash bin on her laptop. One click, and it was gone. In its place, she created a new folder, New Beginnings. That afternoon, she drove out to Salem. The sky was pale blue, streaked with soft clouds. The cemetery was quiet, dotted with brittle leaves and patches of sunlight. She parked under the oak tree and walked to her father's grave. The marble was clean, the engraved letters sharp and familiar. She knelt down, brushing away a few fallen leaves, and placed a single white lily on the grass. "It's over now," she whispered. "You can rest. And so can I." She stayed there for a long time, talking softly about small things, the smell of coffee, the chill in the air, how strange it felt to live without fear. Her father's silence, as always, was the only answer she needed. When she drove home, dusk had settled over the city. The lights shimmered against the wet pavement, car windows reflecting gold. She stopped at a small bakery near her apartment, bought a slice of pumpkin pie, and smiled at the cashier who wished her a good night. Simple kindnesses, how easily she had forgotten their weight. Back home, she set the pie on the table, lit a candle, and sat down. The apartment glowed softly, warm and calm. Outside, a breeze swept through the street, carrying laughter from somewhere far below. She opened her journal, flipping to a clean page. Her pen moved slowly, deliberately. December 7th. The storm is gone. Mom is finally facing herself. Ethan is growing up. I'm learning to live, not to please. Justice didn't come from anger, it came from peace. I didn't win. I just stopped losing. She paused, letting the ink dry, then added another line. Sometimes revenge looks like silence, and freedom looks like finally breathing without guilt. Rachel closed the journal and leaned back in her chair. The candle flame flickered gently, its light reflecting off the framed photo across the room. She smiled. Outside, the city moved on. Life went on, and she was ready to move with it. She took a deep breath and looked out the window at the glowing skyline. "You know," she said softly to the quiet room, "I think I'm finally thankful." The words lingered warm and true. She thought about all the people watching, people who might have stood where she once did, trapped in family cycles, afraid to draw boundaries, still waiting for permission to be free. Her gaze softened. "If you've ever been where I was," she said, her voice low but steady. "If you've ever carried the weight of other people's expectations, I hope you find your peace too. I hope you learn that walking away isn't cruel, it's survival." She smiled, the candlelight catching in her eyes. "Tell me, have you ever had to let go of someone to find yourself again? I'd love to hear your story. Share it below. Maybe someone who needs to hear it will find it." Her tone lightened, almost playful. And if stories like this remind you that even broken families can lead to beautiful strength, stay here with me. There are more stories to tell, of healing, of justice, of finally choosing yourself. So don't forget to subscribe, and we'll walk through the next one together. Rachel glanced once more at the window where the reflection of her small, peaceful life shone back at her. Then she whispered, "Here's to new beginnings." The candle flickered once steady and calm. Outside the night deepened, but for the first time in years, Rachel's world stayed bright.